In 1959, the United States Army cut a city into the ice of northern Greenland. Not a camp, a city. 26 trenches carved down into the ice sheet and roofed over, more than 3 kilometers of them holding barracks for 200 men, a kitchen, a hospital, a chapel, a barber shop, and, at the end of one tunnel, a nuclear reactor. They called it Camp Century. On the surface, there was almost nothing to see. A flat white plain, a few vent pipes, the wind. This is the story of that buried city. What it was officially, what it was secretly, and why. After only a few years, the people who built it shut off the lights and walked away. Because the part that matters is not that they built it. It is that they left it, certain the snow would bury it deeper every year, forever. The ice had other plans. To understand why anyone would build a city inside a glacier, you have to look at a map the way the Cold War looked at it. The shortest line between the United States and the Soviet Union does not run across the Atlantic. It runs over the top of the world, across the Arctic, and sitting directly on that line was Greenland, a Danish territory mostly covered by an ice sheet up to 3 kilometers thick, almost empty of people. For a military planning for nuclear war, it was the most valuable empty ground in the northern hemisphere. Close to the enemy, hard to reach, and almost impossible to watch. We're going to get to what they hid up there. If you keep files like this one open, the records that were classified, abandoned, and then almost forgotten, subscribe. The long archives adds a new one every Sunday. Now, back to the ice. The United States had already negotiated access. Under a 1951 defense agreement with Denmark, American forces operated in Greenland, and by the mid-1950s, the giant air base at Thule in the northwest was a hub of Arctic strategy. But an air base is a fixed target on a map. What the Army began to imagine at the end of the 1950s was something that could not be targeted, because no one would know exactly where it was. The first step was to prove that people could live and work year-round on top of the ice sheet itself, not at its edge, but deep in the interior where the surface is nothing but snow in every direction. In 1959, the Army Corps of Engineers went up onto the ice and began to dig. The work was presented to the public and to the world's press as a scientific project. Camp Century, a polar research station, a demonstration of Arctic engineering. That description was true. It was simply not the whole of it. Building on an ice sheet is not like building on land, and the first thing the engineers had to accept is that there is no ground. Only compressed snow that behaves over time like a very slow liquid. Their method was called cut and cover. Huge rotary snowplows, capable of throwing thousands of tons of snow a day, carved long open trenches into the surface, some of them more than 200 meters long and 8 meters deep. Over each trench, the crews arched corrugated steel, and then let the blowing Arctic snow drift over the steel and seal it. Inside the covered trenches, they assembled prefabricated wooden buildings, raised slightly off the trench floor so the heat would not melt them down into the ice. The result was a town with streets of packed snow, lit 24 hours a day, where the temperature outside could fall to 60 below zero while the men inside worked in shirt sleeves. The hardest problem was power. You cannot haul diesel across a moving ice sheet forever, and the camp's appetite for heat and electricity was enormous. So in 1960, the Army brought in the PM-2A, a portable nuclear reactor, one of a series designed to be broken into pieces small enough to fly to a base and assemble on site. Its components were shipped to Thule and then dragged overland across the ice to Camp Century, where the reactor was rebuilt at the end of a tunnel and brought online. It ran on highly enriched uranium and supplied the city with power for roughly 33 months. Camp Century became the only nuclear-powered settlement ever built inside an ice sheet, and it functioned. 200 people lived under the snow. They ate in a mess hall, were treated in a small hospital, attended services in a chapel cut from the ice. There was a library, a theater, a store. Fresh water came from what is called a Rodriguez well, a chamber melted down into the glacier with the reactor's waste heat, so that the camp drank meltwater from ice that had fallen as snow long before there was a United States. The place was strange enough that the Army made it a showpiece. Journalists were flown in, films were made, and in 1960, 2 teenage Boy Scouts, one American and one Danish, were brought up onto the ice to spend a few weeks living in the tunnels as guests. They went home with exactly the story the Army wanted told, a triumph of engineering, men living where no one had lived before. Every part of that story was real. None of it was the reason the camp had been built. The army had not spent this kind of money to prove that soldiers could live under the ice. It had spent it to find out whether something else could live there. Something that moved and carried a warhead. The real project was buried one layer deeper than the city itself, and it had a name that appeared in none of the press releases. Project Iceworm was a plan to turn the Greenland ice sheet into the largest concealed missile base in the world. The concept took the trench digging of Camp Century and imagined it multiplied across an enormous grid. By some plans, a network of tunnels covering tens of thousands of square miles, holding hundreds of ballistic missiles. A modified shortened Minuteman, nicknamed the Iceman, with a range of around 3,300 miles, would be moved along rails between firing positions inside that grid. The Soviets might know the missiles were somewhere under the Greenland ice. They would never know which tunnel held which missile at any given moment, because the missiles would not stay still. Camp Century was the proof of concept, the test of whether the whole frozen arsenal could be built and lived in at all. There was a serious problem with this plan, and it was not engineering, it was Denmark. Greenland was Danish territory, and Denmark had adopted in 1957 a firm policy against nuclear weapons on its soil in peacetime. A network of American nuclear missiles under the Greenland ice would violate that policy completely, so Denmark was not told. The Danish government understood that it had approved a scientific research station and an experimental reactor. It had not approved and did not know it was being asked to host a hidden nuclear strike force, because the part of the plan that mattered was kept from it. That secret held for decades. It was only in 1997 that the full scope of Project Iceworm became public, when a Danish institute, working through declassified documents, laid out what the camp had really been for. By then, most of the men who built it were old, and the ice itself had long since rendered the question moot, because Iceworm was never cancelled by a government or exposed by a spy. It was cancelled by the glacier. The planners had treated the ice sheet as if it were solid bedrock with a cold climate on top. It is not. Glacial ice flows under its own weight, and it deforms anything rigid placed inside it. Within 2 years, the trenches at Camp Century were closing in. The walls bulged, the roofs pressed down. By 1962, the ceiling of the reactor room had deformed so badly that it had to be lifted and trimmed back to keep from crushing the equipment. Measurements of the moving ice showed it was deforming faster than the models had predicted, fast enough that the tunnels would be unusable within years, not decades. A missile base that slowly crushes itself is not a missile base. In 1963, Iceworm was abandoned as unworkable. The reactor was shut down and removed in 1964. And in 1967, the last crews left Camp Century for good. They did not dismantle the city. They took out the reactor's core and the most sensitive equipment, switched off what was left, and walked out, leaving the steel arches, the buildings, the fuel tanks, and the waste exactly where they sat. The reasoning behind that decision was written into the environment itself, and at the time it seemed unanswerable. This is the interior of an ice sheet. It only ever snows here. Anything we leave will be buried under more snow every single year, sinking deeper into the ice, sealed away beyond anyone's reach for as long as the ice exists. For almost half a century, that reasoning held. In the years it operated, Camp Century produced something its planners never set out to create, and it changed how the world understands its own future. To study the ice they were building in, the scientists at the camp did not just dig into it, they drilled through it. In 1966, the drill at Camp Century reached the bedrock beneath the ice sheet, more than 1,300 meters down, and recovered the first complete ice core ever taken all the way to the bottom of a glacier. That core was an archive in the most literal sense, layer after annual layer of frozen snowfall, each one trapping a sample of the atmosphere at the moment it fell, stretching back more than 100,000 years. Working with cores like this one, the Danish scientist Willy Donsgaard showed that the ratio of oxygen isotopes locked in the ice records the temperature at the time the snow fell. That insight is one of the foundations of paleoclimatology, the science that reconstructs the planet's past climate and, from it, models the climate to come. A base built to hide nuclear missiles had, almost as a side effect, helped to launch the science of climate change, and decades later that science turned back to look at the base. In 2016, a team led by the glaciologist William Colgan published a study in the journal Geophysical Research Letters. They asked a question no one had formally asked before. What exactly is still down there, and will it stay buried? First, they built an inventory. The physical waste left at Camp Century is substantial. on the order of 200,000 liters of diesel fuel, polychlorinated biphenyls, the toxic industrial chemicals known as PCBs, and a large volume of sewage and wastewater, tens of millions of liters of it, left in unlined pits in the ice. There is also low-level radioactive coolant from the reactor's operation. All of it is spread across roughly 136 acres, sealed under decades of accumulated snow. Then they ran the climate models forward, and the result is the part worth sitting with. Under a continued high emission scenario, the surface at Camp Century could cross a threshold, from a place that gains ice every year to a place that loses it. Once a site begins to melt at the surface faster than snow accumulates, the buried layers stop sinking and start coming back up. Colgan's team estimated that this transition is plausible before the end of this century, and that the waste could begin to re-emerge around the year 2090. That date is a projection, not a measurement. It depends on emissions choices that have not yet been made, and the real number could move in either direction. But the direction of the danger is not in dispute. The process the planners were counting on, perpetual burial, can run in reverse. The ice that was supposed to be a permanent lid is in some scenarios becoming a slow door. That leaves a question that is not scientific at all and that no one has answered. The base was built and used by the United States. The ice is part of Greenland, which governs more of its own affairs with each passing decade. The territory was, and partly remains, Denmark's responsibility, and Denmark was never told the full truth in the first place. If the diesel and the PCBs and the rest begin to surface, whose job is it to clean them up? When the study was published, that question moved within weeks from the laboratory into the foreign ministries of 3 governments. Greenland's officials raised it publicly. Denmark and the United States acknowledged it and began cautiously to discuss it. But there is no precedent for this, no treaty written for the day a melting glacier hands back a Cold War base, and no agreement has been reached on who is responsible, or on whether a cleanup is even physically possible on a surface that is still, today, slowly moving. The waste is not an emergency yet. It is a bill with no name on it, post-dated to a year when most of the people who could be asked about it will be gone. If you find this worth keeping, the record of what was built, hidden, and abandoned, and what the warming world is slowly handing back, subscribe and follow the rest of the archive. There is a new entry every Sunday, and each one is its own buried city. There is a flat white plain in northern Greenland. From the air it looks like every other part of the ice sheet, featureless, silent, the kind of place where nothing has happened and nothing is happening. That impression is accurate for the surface. It is not accurate for what lies about 30 meters beneath it. Down there in the dark and the cold, the city is still largely as it was left. The steel arches, the emptied trenches, the fuel drums, and the waste pits, frozen in the positions they held when the last crew climbed out in 1967. It was sealed by men who believed the cold would keep their secret for as long as anyone could imagine. And for a while the cold did exactly that. The same flowing ice that crushed their missile plan went on to preserve almost everything else they left behind. The people who built Camp Century drilled through the ice to read the climate of the deep past. What they read, in the decades that followed, became part of the evidence that the climate is now changing. And it is that change, the one their own ice core helped the world to measure, that may, before the next century is out, lift the snow off the city they were certain would never be found. The plain is quiet. The map shows nothing. The archive is 30 meters down, and the ice is no longer keeping it.